The Warped Tour Music Festival is one of the most important festivals in alternative music history. This was the beginning for bands like Paramore, My Chemical Romance, Fall Out Boy, and so much more. Warped Tour drew 500,000 fans every single summer, and it didn't look like it was slowing down anytime soon. So what happened? Why would such an important festival that's keeping the alternative music scene alive just stop? There were a ton of controversies that came with this festival. There were bad decisions, tense moments between the founder and fans, problems with bands that played the festival, but the ultimate evil was social media. Let's talk about the rise and fall of Warped Tour. The summer of 1995 was Warped Tour's first run, founded by Kevin Lyman and Ray Woodbury, and apparently this was the worst year in Warped Tour history. Financially, at least, because later down the line things do get really weird. Before Warped Tour, Kevin Lyman was a promoter in LA. He's been in the game for over 10 years, hosting countless of shows. And fun fact, the company that Kevin worked with was Golden Voice. Golden Voice now throws huge festivals like 88 Rising's Head in the Clouds, Tyler the Creator's Camp Flog Gnaw, No Values, and the biggest festival in the country, Coachella. In 1991, Kevin was asked to help out Jane's Addiction's farewell tour, and some of you may know, this farewell tour was so massive, it was a goodbye to Jane's Addiction, but it was the birth of Lollapalooza. Kevin's role was to be a stage manager for the annual tour. He was passionate about music and throwing these banger shows, and he noticed around this time that skating and snowboarding was becoming popular. So he thought to himself, how can we fuse the world of extreme sports and punk music? Easy. Have some punk bands play sets while having some skate ramps throughout the venue for the ultimate mid-90s skater kid vibe. The fusion was great. A lot of people that were into skating and shit were already into punk music, so this fusion was a no-brainer. As for Ray Woodbury, I'm not sure why it's so hard to find information on this man, and I'm not sure what contribution he had to the festival or how long he's been active. Nothing. I hit up his business page on Instagram, which is RK Diversified Entertainment. It looks like this company takes care of the back end for events like the stage production, the lighting, designing, audio, all that stuff. And I know this company was also associated with Golden Voice, so my guess is Ray just took care of all of that back end stuff for Warped Tour. Hopefully his Instagram replies and we could get a full breakdown of what he actually did and for how long, but for now we gotta continue the story. As for the first Warped Tour, it flopped because there was a few missing components which makes a festival successful, which was a budget, ticket sales, and people. Not many people pulled up, but Kevin didn't want to give up on this dream. When year 2 rolled around, Kevin managed to book 2 large bands at the time, which were NoFX and Pennywise. And having bands of this size at the time is already stretching the budget. Warped Tour didn't have a sponsor yet, and everything was just coming out of pocket. And Kevin's business partner at the time, who I'm assuming was Ray, he wanted to connect Warped Tour with Calvin Klein at first, and if you don't know what Calvin Klein is, this is what their clothes look like. It's not super fitting for a festival that crosses extreme sports and punk music, but it's crazy because the stars actually aligned for Kevin Lyman, because he was actually contacted by one of the founders of Vans so he can run an amateur skate program for the brand. Kevin worked his magic and actually left the interview 15 minutes later, and instead of working for Vans, they agreed to sponsor the tour for 1996. And this was a great deal for both ways because Kevin got the money he needed to fund the festival and Vans became closer to their market. So as long as Warped Tour grows, so does Vans. And Vans sponsored every single tour since. As the years go by, Warped Tour starts to become more and more popular. But what made this festival so special? It feels like Warped Tour was special for different reasons as time went on. Despite 1995 being the worst year financially, that was just behind the scenes because the actual fest was amazing.
It was really interesting because the tour kind of got legitimized because people heard what a crazy first year that was. Sublime, a bunch of pirates.
It sounded like a great time, and as I said before, as time moves forward, it attracts people for different reasons. But the tour inevitably pissed off some of the older heads too. Let's touch on the good the bad, and the ugly when it comes to Warped Tour lineups. The lineups were always a combination of different alternative music genres, but it always leaned more into the punk side of things, in the earlier years at least. As time went on, the lineups just got bigger and expanded on more genres, having damn near 100 bands playing at some point. It started to become a thing where people got butthurt over Warped Tour lineups because it's not punk enough, having bands like My Chemical Romance from First to Last and Fall Out Boy in 2004. But I don't see anyone complaining over 1999's lineup that had Eminem, Ice-T, and the Black Eyed Peas. I found out I was wrong. Apparently nobody liked having these artists on Warped Tour. They even threw shit at Eminem and pissed him off. I'm not surprised at the direction the lineup went because I think it makes sense to have Blink-182 and Fall Out Boy on the same bill. If bands like Glassjaw, Jimmy Eat World, and Weezer played in those earlier years, why are we surprised at the direction the lineups are going towards? But it does feel like the 2004 lineup was lubing up the fans for the following year, because 2005 is when Warped Tour started catering more towards metalcore and pop punk. 2005 had bands like A Day to Remember, Motionless in White, Good Charlotte, The Fall of Troy, and so much more. And Kevin knew that people were upset at the shift in the scene, so he made sure to pay homage by having these classic bands in almost every single Warped Tour. Looking at the final year of Warped Tour, they had bands like the Aquabats, Less Than Jake, and Anti-Flag. The year before, they had Less Than Jake, Real Big Fish, and that's it. I guess people weren't satisfied at the amount of classic bands there were in all these Warped Tour bills. But the early 2000s was around the time these lineups got so fucking massive, and I'm sure you can imagine how tough it would be to have all these bands play in one single day. So what was the solution to that problem? Have a stupid amount of stages. 1995 had one stage, 1996 had two. Then in later years you had lineups that were reaching 90 plus bands, so they had to have between 6 to 8 stages. And I didn't even mention this yet, but time slots were different every single day. One day you can have a behemoth of a band like Bring Me the Horizon close off the night. Then the next day, Bring Me the Horizon could be playing first. I think this was a great system for the bands, but a terrible system for the fans. If you don't know, playing early while in a band is kind of lame, because if doors open at 11 and your band plays at 11:30, you're not gonna have the same crowd as if you're a 8 p.m. band closing off the night, since people are still entering the venue and trying to figure out what time their favorite bands play. But it's a good opportunity for all of the musicians because it's not always a powerhouse closing off the night. Sometimes the band closing the night would be one you discovered right there and then. But as a fan, how do I know where and when Bring Me the Horizon will play that day? These thingies. When you enter the venue, there are two ways to grab your schedule for the day. Either get a sheet of paper that the staff gives out to you, or take a picture of this giant inflatable thingy. This will tell you what stage your band will be playing and at what time. But you gotta take a look at one of these two options, map out your day, and then haul ass to your first band. And hopefully you don't get lost, because a lot of these stages are so fucking far apart from each other, so if you get lost, you're destroying your time. The lamest thing was if you were on one side of the venue watching your band, and then the next band you want to see is on the other side of the venue, you gotta sprint like half a mile just to catch your other band. And before we close the stages chapter, I want to cover the variety of different stages there were. So an average year will have two main stages right next to each other that most of the time would have the biggest acts. Then you have Journey's left and right foot stages, also right next to each other, having bands that were slightly less popular, I think. To be honest, I don't know if there was an actual strategy behind that, because you'll have a band like Rome that would play main stage. Then you have State Champs playing the Journey stage. There was also the Monster Energy stage, or stages. These stages were pretty cool because they had this truck that you can chill in, cool down, and just drink unlimited amount of free Monster Energies. I'm not gonna front, unlimited monsters for free sounds like a terrible idea, but hey man, whatever. And then you'll have extra stages that'll be more for the smaller bands. The Kevin Says stage featured acts that were on the rise and you should probably keep your eye on them. And then you have the Ernie Ball stage that would typically be a local Battles of the Bands winner, along with some other bands that were underground and unsigned and just needed this push for their career. But there were a bunch of different stages every single year. Sometimes you'll have the acoustic tent or a comedy tent, and sometimes there's DJ stages. And there was a bunch of other cool shit other than stages. There were merch tents for every single band. There were trucks and tents that had games and prizes. You can pick up some jewelry at a vendor, maybe grab some food. They had free water refills and even had a reverse daycare tent where the parents can chill as their kids go and act like hooligans around the festival. And a notable program they did for 2 years straight was the Warped YouTubers program, which we'll touch on in a second. But a really cool thing that I think attracted people was you can pull up to Warped Tour completely broke and still go home with a bunch of free shit. And in general, I think Warped Tour was super popular because it was an inexpensive thing to do. Warped Tour tickets were maximum $50. They even let parents in for free at some point, versus other festivals that you'd be spending $200+ for a one-day pass. And I think that's because Kevin knew exactly who were pulling up to these shows. It wasn't grown adults with jobs that can probably afford the $200 tickets. It was mostly kids that had no job and had to beg their parents for money. And before closing off this chapter, I have to point out again that this was a one-day festival. All the stages, the tents, the inflatable, everything had to get built up and taken down the same day. Warped Tour even had a show on Fuse that showed us the back end of things called Warped Roadies. But we'll get to that and the other TV media things involving this festival in a second. Warped Tour being a one-day thing was extremely bittersweet. It was an escape for one day, and you get to hang out with all the alt kids in your state. There were long-distance friendships that would link up at the festival. You can meet people, go with your friends, wear whatever you want without being judged, and it was overall a really cool experience. The only complaint if you were an attendee was if two of your favorite bands were playing at the same time. Then it'd be over. But luckily the Warped Tour dates were semi-close to each other. I can't speak for every single location, but I was able to go to 2 dates every year, which were Camden and Homedale, because they were right there by each other. And there was one year where I even managed to hit the Scranton date. But I saw Warped Tour as this giant like sampler you would get from Buffalo Wild Wings. You get a taste of every single band, and then you get to decide, okay, I like seeing this band live, or I don't like seeing this band live. That way, if one of these bands go on tour and they hit your area, you can decide if you want to see them do a set that's way longer than 30 minutes. Now, I have a question for you. What comes with so much stain and popularity? Media. Warped Tour had a show on Fuse TV, which was Warped Roadies. This was a TV series that lasted 2 seasons, and it showcased the back end of stage production and what it was like being a roadie for the festival. It showed all the good and all the bad, and it was a really cool watch for me and made me feel a little bit more connected with the festival. Someone even did a documentary on Warped Tour. It was titled No Room for Rock Stars, which followed a few different musicians around and showed the struggles they were going through. You had musicians like Christopher Drew of Never Shout Never feeling like a zoo animal and not being comfortable with the business side of the tour and music industry in general. You had Mitch Lucker of Suicide Silence missing his family back at home. It followed around Mike Posner. He had a song that popped off and he did some headlining shows right before Warped Tour. He was playing to 2,000 people every single night, and now he's playing a festival outside of his niche, and it kind of offends him. And it makes him feel like his time is being wasted when only 200 kids pull up to his set. But throughout the tour, he did a bunch of things like photo shoots and press, and overall, it showed that he was kind of too successful to be on Warped Tour. And lastly, it followed around the band Forever Came Calling. This band wasn't a part of the tour, but they hopped in their own van following around the tour. Their goal was just to promote their music to as many people as possible, so they would go in the line and just sell their CDs for $5. Eventually, they got Kevin Lyman's attention and they managed to play the Warped Tour. And the last show we'll touch on is Warped Inside Out. This came out a few years before Warped Roadies, and it's pretty similar in the sense where it just showcases the back end of things. IMBD states, this 6-episode series tells the stories that are unique to the punk rock subculture of the Warped Tour, and how the bands, fans, and production team really live, work, play, and survive, traveling through over 80 cities in 60 days with over 100 bands. And while we're on the topic of Warped Tour media, we have to talk about Warped YouTubers. I'm not going to go too in depth because I did that for last week's upload, but basically Kevin noticed that there were emo YouTubers and they shared this audience with Warped Tour. So he invited them to tour for 2014 and 2015. This was a great program. Hundreds of kids waited in line just to take pictures with their favorite YouTubers. He invited creators like Brian Stars, D Fizzy, Johnny Gilbert, Jordan Sweeto, and so much more. But the Warped YouTubers program had its own downfall. It didn't work out, and I think Kevin Lyman just figured like, hey man, this is just a bunch of headache and drama and I don't want to deal with this on tour. And a lot of serious went down, like Austin Jones being a file, but the whole thing was a hot mess. Like, a lot of bands didn't like them, a lot of fans didn't like them, even though they drew their own huge amount of crowds. But we'll get into all of that later. But with all that being said, if you were in a band, you more than likely wanted to play Warped Tour. You get to travel the country and tour with other huge bands you look up to. You get all this exposure and all these new eyes on you. You get to network, make friends, make connections, and just be a part of this huge music scene. I'm sure you'll be surprised to hear that there were a handful of bands that refused to play Warped Tour. And now we get into the negatives. There were a handful of bands that actually refused to play Warped Tour. Bands include Modern Baseball, Touche Amor, sorry if I said that wrong, La Dispute, and Balance and Composure. The only reason why we know of this information is because Kevin Lyman himself name-dropped these bands. Kerrang has a podcast titled Inside Track, and Kevin Lyman was a guest for this podcast.
The bands I thought would have been fantastic for this would have been bands like Balance and Composure, La Dispute, Touche Amor. I love those bands. I think they're great musical bands. But their little attitudes of like their little community, they don't want to break out of that little community. And I would sit there and I'd be like, Modern Baseball, I think could have been one of the most massive bands out there. But they get caught up in their own bull. No one's too precious to break out of your own shell. And I felt they were. And I'd watch their careers every year I'd send offers. Just, oh, we don't want to tour with those bands. We don't want to be we don't want to be a Warped-esque band. And I'd be like, dude, Warped-esque bands, Bad Religion, Day to Remember. Some of the biggest bands of our whole scene built Paramore, you know?
And I think this is what most of those bands were probably thinking. There's no way to confirm that, but I'm only going with it because Kevin also says that these bands don't want to break out of their little community. But what's wrong with being a Warped-esque band? Like, why wouldn't you want all this exposure? Warped Tour had this 25-year lifespan, and I think it'd be foolish to think that out of those 25 years, there'd be no controversies. Especially because this is a festival that involves hundreds of people. Drama and problems are inevitable in this kind of environment, and I think drama played a huge role in the decline of Warped Tour. I know we already set the stage, but before we get into this decline, I just want to give you a summary of this festival really quick. Warped Tour is loved by hundreds of thousands. It built a community that I think was much needed. It was mostly positive and everyone was looking forward to this festival every summer, including fans, bands, and roadies, everyone involved. And lastly, I think Warped Tour was the biggest thing that kept this alternative music community like alive and tight, because ever since Warped Tour stopped, it just feels like the alt community is just completely scattered. We don't have this hub anymore, and it feels like all these music genres are more segregated than ever. I think this festival needed to exist. But throughout the years, we did have some controversial bands play the festival, including one Kevin mentioned in this podcast, Attilla. I guess we can use Attilla as an example of why these emo bands kind of steered away from playing Warped. This is what Kevin had to say.
And then I started seeing the bands, and this is what kind of pissed me off. Because in 1997, 98, Pennywise couldn't judge a band until they met him in a parking lot. Then I started watching this community tear itself apart from within. That this band would, not even meeting these people, they just didn't agree with their music or the way they looked, bashing that band online. And then people would come up to me and say, well, I don't want to be on Warped Tour because Attila's on Warped Tour. And I'd say, have you met the guys in Attilla? No, I just don't like their, suck my fuck, what the fuck is that? I'm going, look, we're not here to judge each other's music. The fans will judge each other's music. Attilla brings people. Do I personally run around singing "Suck My Fuck"? No. Do I? Do you? No. But you know what? They're fans. Somehow they're grabbing. They're good musicians, and they're not bad people. I've never seen them do a bad thing to someone. Some of the stuff he says maybe is just more stupidity.
Bands not wanting to share a stage with someone like Attilla, that's one thing. But the biggest problem that bands and even fans had with Kevin Lyman specifically was his second chances rule. In late 2014, Front Porch Step got accused for sending inappropriate messages and images to minors. After the allegations came out, he canceled all future tour dates. And there was a petition to ensure that he doesn't play on Warped Tour 2015. That petition had over 13,000 people signing on it. Jake McElfresh, the man behind Front Porch Step, then comes out with this statement months later. And you can pause the video now to read the entire thing. After I read it, it seems like Jake is just saying, yeah, I had a bunch of online girlfriends and all the messages that's been sent has been with consent. I've never physically done something with a minor, so why is everyone going around calling me a pedo? It's a pretty weird statement and I suggest you read it. But at the end of it, he said he's going to be playing music again and he hopes to see his fans this summer. July 2015 rolled around and Kevin Lyman actually let Front Porch Step play the Nashville date. Kevin stated that he had a conversation with Jake's counselor who said that the show would be a part of his therapy. But Jake wouldn't be paid for the show and it was a one-date thing. Kevin also stated he let Jake play the show because he hasn't been charged with anything or got arrested. He says if he was a legitimate danger to anyone, he simply wouldn't be here, which fans and bands didn't like. One guy even went to the Front Porch Step set and he says, but Kevin is the type of guy to give people second chances. From his mouth, he says the majority of my early Warped Tour crew guys all spent a little time in jail for stupid decisions. A lot of them were selling meth or whatever and did their time, and I gave them their second chance. And that built loyalty, giving a second chance to people. But the problem here is this is not that. It's not a case of someone selling drugs. These are legit like creeps and weirdos that have this main source of people that they typically prey upon. Other artists that he let play the festival include Mike Fuentes, Johnny Craig, and Davi Vanity. Billboard did an interview with Kevin Lyman, and they asked him what was it like dealing with these issues of sexual harassment on the tour in recent years. He says, well, that harassment didn't happen on Warped Tour. If you go through every one of those stories, it didn't happen on Warped Tour. The Johnny Craig thing did happen on Warped Tour and I addressed it the same way. We've sent him away and then all of a sudden I've got to have a town hall meeting with it. But if you really go through all of that stuff, things happen prior to the tour or things ... It's a part of the culture. I don't personally think that assaulting people is a part of music culture, but other controversies went down as well. Like in 2016 and 17, there was a pro-life abortion tent. And a lot of people were upset that there's a lack of female representation in a lot of these Warped Tour lineups. People say that Warped Tour is like this giant bro culture thing, which I'm assuming is more of like the back end of things because the actual fans, it was pretty diverse between men and women. But with all that being said, there's no surprise that there are a handful of bands that refuse to be a Warped-esque band or support the festival by playing on it. They don't want to give this image like they don't care about the controversies that went down. And I think there's a sense of pride that comes with blowing up and becoming extremely successful without the help of a giant festival like Warped Tour. And I'm sure Kevin knew exactly where this was going when he saw that there were bands that didn't want to play. It took 24 cross-country tours in a row for Kevin Lyman to finally call it quits. He made this statement on all of the Warped Tour socials. Today, with many mixed feelings, I'm here to announce that next year will be the final full cross-country run of the Vans Warped Tour. This led to a lot of people being upset. Bands that dreamt about playing Warped Tour will never get the chance. Fans that went to Warped Tour yearly will never be able to experience that Warped Tour holiday feeling again. Not being able to take your future kids to experience this awesome festival like you did when you were a kid made people's hearts sink. But before we get into Kevin's reasoning for ending the tour, we have to touch on Warped Tour's 25th anniversary events. Instead of it being a one-day festival with 40 plus dates, there were 3 different events. July 20 and 21st would be the Mountain View, California dates, a 2-day festival with other events like motocross wrestling, a Warped Museum, and Vert Ramp. June 29th and 30th would be the Atlantic City, New Jersey dates. Again, a 2-day festival with a vert ramp, motocross, wrestling, Warped Museum, and a human cannonball. And a date that pissed off the Midwest was the June 8th date in Cleveland, Ohio, which wasn't a festival. It was a grand opening show for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There was a mini vert ramp and an after party, but fans were upset to see the lineup only had 5 bands, while the other 2 events were full 2-day festivals. These events were extremely successful. I didn't go to any of these shows, so I can't speak firsthand of the vibe and how it felt, but after watching some vlogs, I guess I can kind of get a feel. The Atlantic City date looked awesome. They had a stage on the sand and everyone was moshing by the beach, and the boardwalk was filled with emo kids. And the California date looked fun too. It definitely looked more like the classic Warped Tour vibe, but it was cool to see skate ramps on the tour again. As for the Ohio date, there's not that much content on this event. It definitely seemed like this show was kind of this side thing because I don't know, it feels like it was just like a promotion for this big Warped Tour like exhibit in this museum. They opened a special exhibit showcasing memories, instruments, unique set pieces, and more specifically for Warped Tour. And that was it. That's the final 3 events we've ever got from Warped Tour. There's a few reasons why Kevin Lyman called it quits. One reason is the fan elitism. A good chunk of people wanted Warped Tour to be the same every single year. Like we said earlier, the 90s crowd got annoyed that it steered into emo, pop punk, and metalcore. And I'm sure if the tour existed today, we'd have a good amount of SoundCloud rappers on it because that's the direction that alt music moved towards. And you know that the emo, metalcore, and pop punk kids wouldn't be happy with that. As social media started becoming more and more prominent, Kevin was able to see exactly what people thought at all times, and he didn't like what he saw. And the other thing that came with social media is bands addressing what they don't like about the tour publicly. Before social media, Kevin was cool with all the bands and there was a community. Kevin was actually friends with the bands. If there was a problem, Kevin would be confronted. Now that there's a lot of younger bands fresh to the scene, they see Kevin more as a disciplinary figure and like a tour dad, rather than a friend like the older bands such as Pennywise and Bad Religion. Kevin states that the earlier years of Warped Tour, no one judged each other until they met. In later years, bands can just hop on each other's social medias, see what they stand for, and immediately not like the people in said band, which would cause a divide and damage the community that was once there. Again, using Attilla as an example. People didn't like them because they saw what they said and posted on social media, so they avoid playing the festival. Or if they did decide to play the tour, they would avoid Attilla instead of meeting the band like face to face and forming their own opinion off of that interaction. Kevin just really misses that community. And speaking of Attilla, Chris Franzak was actually supposed to buy Warped Tour.
I wanted to be the person that brings Warped Tour back.
Really? So that's still a conversation or a possibility?
For legal reasons, Warped Tour cannot come back for another 3 years or so. And me and the founder, Kevin Lyman, are actually good friends. For the 4 years we did Warped Tour, I was hustling my clothing company, Stay Sick on Warped as well. Mm-hmm. So I was awake bright and early every morning, and no band dudes wake up in the morning. And Kevin saw that and respected me for wanting to work hard. He pulled me aside in San Diego and was like, Franz, like, do you want to buy Warped Tour? Like, do you want to take over? Like, I'm done. I retouched conversation with him shortly after just to be like, hey, I'm serious. Like, I want to do this for legal reasons, which I can't go into depth. Warped Tour can't come back for at least another 3 years or so. But after that, I'm happy to reopen conversation, and hopefully I'm the one that brings it back because I have a really good plan for how to make it sustainable and make Warped Tour even bigger than it's ever been. The last time I spoke to him about it, he basically said that I think him taking a break away from Warped Tour for a few years allowed him to see how much love there was for Warped Tour in demand. Yeah. So I think he is probably going to reintroduce the Warped Tour brand. But he did say that it might not be like a full like countrywide touring festival. So I don't really know exactly what he has planned for Warped Tour, but I do think we'll see it in some kind of dose.
I hyper-focus on the downfall of Warped YouTubers. Click right here to go watch that video.